Ars Notoria, Episode 5, Chapter 7, When Systems Push Back. The first signs of resistance. Resistance does not begin as opposition. It begins as misalignment. There is no clear moment where a system is challenged directly. No declaration, no visible conflict. Instead, the first signs appear as subtle inconsistencies, small deviations that fail to fully integrate into the established structure. At first, they are easy to dismiss. An outcome that feels slightly off. A response that arrives with a fraction of delay. A pattern that repeats but without the same precision it once held. These are not breakdowns. They are distortions. But most systems do not recognize them, because internally everything still appears stable. Feedback loops continue to function. Thresholds remain in place. Energy still flows through dominant pathways. From the inside, the architecture feels intact, which is exactly why resistance is difficult to detect at this stage. It does not confront the system directly. It alters its edges. The first disruptions occur where structure meets environment. Points where the system interacts with external conditions begin to show instability. Slight increases in friction appear where movement was previously smooth. Timing becomes inconsistent. Synchronization weakens without fully collapsing. Nothing fails, but coherence begins to loosen. This is the entry point of external pressure, not through force, but through interference. Because once a system reaches a high level of stability, it begins to affect its surroundings. It pulls attention, redirects flow, reshapes conditions beyond its own boundaries. And these changes create imbalance in adjacent systems. Imbalance generates response. Not coordinated, not visible, but distributed. Multiple external forces begin to push back in small, unaligned ways. Each introduces a minor disturbance. Each creates a slight deviation. Individually, they appear insignificant. Together, they begin to alter behavior at the margins. This is the first layer of resistance. Not opposition, but disruption. And disruption is more dangerous. Because opposition can be identified. Disruption blends into normal variation. It hides inside noise. And by the time it becomes visible, the system is already under pressure. Pressure without source. Once disruption enters the system, it does not announce where it comes from. There is no clear origin point, no identifiable source that can be isolated, analyzed, or removed. Instead, pressure appears distributed. It emerges across multiple points at once, creating the impression that instability is internal rather than introduced. This is what makes early resistance difficult to respond to, because the system cannot locate the threat. From the inside, everything still seems structurally valid. The logic holds. The pathways exist. The feedback loops continue to operate. Yet outcomes begin to shift. Small inconsistencies multiply. Timing loses precision. Alignment weakens at the margins. The system feels pressure, but cannot define it. This creates a critical vulnerability, because when pressure cannot be traced externally, it is interpreted internally. The system begins to question its own structure. It attempts to correct what appears to be internal instability. It adjusts thresholds. It recalibrates feedback. It increases control over its own mechanisms. But these adjustments do not resolve the issue. They intensify it. Because the source of disruption is not inside the system. It is interacting with it. External systems do not need to attack directly. They only need to interfere with flow. A slight delay introduced at key points. A subtle distortion in feedback timing. A minor redistribution of attention away from central nodes. Each of these changes is small enough to avoid detection, but precise enough to affect behavior. And when these disturbances are applied across multiple points simultaneously, they create a field of pressure. Not a point of conflict. A field. This is what defines advanced resistance. It does not operate through confrontation. It operates through diffusion. No single action is strong enough to trigger response, but the accumulation of small disruptions begins to shift the system's internal balance. Patterns that were once stable require more effort to maintain. Pathways that were once efficient become slightly unstable. Over time, this creates drift. And drift, if not recognized, becomes structural change. This is the moment where the system faces its first real challenge. Not whether it can maintain control, but whether it can correctly identify where control is being challenged from. Because misidentification leads to self-damage, and systems under pressure often begin to weaken themselves before they ever locate the source. Internal destabilization. When pressure cannot be located, the system turns inward, not by choice, by necessity. Because any structure that experiences persistent misalignment must attempt correction. It must identify the source of instability, isolate it, and restore coherence. But when the source cannot be traced externally, the only remaining assumption is internal failure. This is where destabilization begins. The system starts adjusting itself, not strategically, reactively. Thresholds are tightened. Feedback loops are intensified. Latency is reduced in an attempt to restore precision. Friction is redistributed to force alignment back into dominant pathways. Each adjustment is logical in isolation, but collectively, they create distortion. Because the system is no longer responding to its own structure, it is responding to pressure it does not understand. This is the trap. External interference does not need to break the system directly. It only needs to cause misinterpretation. Once the system begins correcting the wrong variables, it starts amplifying the problem it is trying to solve. Feedback loops become too aggressive. They overcorrect minor deviations, creating instability where none previously existed. Thresholds become too restrictive, reducing flexibility and increasing internal tension. Pathways that once allowed controlled variation begin to collapse into rigidity. The system tightens, and in doing so, it loses adaptability. This is how destabilization progresses, not through external destruction, but through internal overcorrection. The architecture begins to distort itself. Small inconsistencies that could have been absorbed now trigger disproportionate responses. Minor disruptions escalate into structural adjustments. The system becomes increasingly sensitive, reacting to signals that previously would have been ignored. Over time, this creates amplification. Noise becomes signal. Signal becomes priority. And priority begins to reshape behavior. At this stage, the system is no longer operating from its original design. It is operating from reaction. And reaction is unstable. Because reaction depends on external input. It shifts with pressure. It adapts without direction. And without direction, coherence begins to fragment. This is the turning point. The system has not been broken, but it has been redirected, away from design, toward response. And once a system begins to respond more than it defines, it loses control over its own trajectory. Escalation through overcorrection. Once internal destabilization begins, the system enters a phase of escalation, not because external pressure increases, but because internal response intensifies. The system, unable to accurately identify the source of disruption, begins to compensate through amplification. It increases control across its own mechanisms. It tightens thresholds further. It accelerates feedback loops. It reduces tolerance for deviation. Every parameter is adjusted in the direction of precision. At first, this appears effective. Alignment temporarily improves. Inconsistencies seem to decrease. The system feels sharper, more controlled, more deliberate. For a brief period, it appears as though stability has been restored. But this is not correction. It is compression. Because the system is not resolving the disturbance, it is constraining its own variability. And variability is not weakness, it is buffer. Without buffer, pressure has nowhere to go, so it builds. This is the paradox of overcorrection. The more aggressively the system tries to eliminate instability, the more sensitive it becomes to it. Small deviations that would have previously dissipated now trigger immediate response. Minor inconsistencies begin to cascade through tightly coupled pathways. Feedback loops, now intensified, begin to reinforce not only alignment, but distortion. This creates escalation, not from the outside, from within. The system begins to operate at higher tension. Every signal carries more weight. Every deviation requires immediate correction. Every fluctuation is treated as a threat to stability. This increases cognitive load, structural rigidity, and internal pressure simultaneously. And under these conditions, precision begins to degrade. Because precision requires flexibility. A system that cannot absorb variation cannot maintain accuracy over time. It begins to oscillate, overcorrecting in one direction, then compensating in another. Stability becomes reactive rather than structural. This is where feedback loops become unstable. Originally designed to reinforce alignment, they now amplify noise. Signals that were once filtered begin to pass through with increased intensity. The system starts responding to fluctuations that are not structurally relevant, diverting energy away from core pathways. Energy distribution begins to distort. High-priority nodes become overloaded. Peripheral structures weaken. Circulation patterns break down as more energy is redirected toward immediate correction rather than long-term stability. The system becomes uneven. This unevenness creates further misalignment, and misalignment triggers further correction. The loop closes. This is escalation, a self-reinforcing cycle where each attempt to restore stability increases instability at a deeper level. At this stage, the system is no longer being shaped by external pressure alone. It is amplifying that pressure internally. This is the critical failure point. Because once escalation becomes self-generated, external interference is no longer required to sustain destabilization. The system begins to maintain its own imbalance. It continues adjusting, tightening, correcting, without ever resolving the original disturbance. It becomes trapped in reaction, and reaction consumes structure. The architect's original design begins to fade, not because it was insufficient, but because it is no longer being followed. The system has shifted from defined architecture to continuous adjustment, from controlled flow to reactive oscillation. And oscillation, over time, erodes coherence. This is where systems break, not in a single moment, but through accumulated overcorrection. Signal corruption. Escalation does not remain contained. Once internal tension reaches a certain level, it begins to affect how the system interprets its own signals. What was once clear becomes ambiguous. What was once filtered becomes indistinguishable from noise. The system does not simply react incorrectly. It begins to misread reality. This is signal corruption, not the loss of data, but the distortion of meaning. At the architectural level, every system depends on signal integrity. Feedback loops rely on accurate input. Thresholds depend on correct evaluation. Energy distribution follows perceived priority. If the signals guiding these mechanisms are altered, even slightly, the entire system begins to drift. Because the system is no longer responding to what is happening, it is responding to what it believes is happening. At first, the corruption is subtle. A signal is amplified more than necessary. A minor fluctuation is interpreted as a significant deviation. Feedback loops respond with increased intensity, reinforcing the misinterpretation. This creates a feedback error. The system adjusts based on incorrect data. And because the adjustment is precise, it strengthens the distortion rather than correcting it. This is the first stage. Localized misinterpretation. Certain nodes begin to behave differently. Certain pathways receive more attention than they should. The system reallocates energy in response to signals that do not accurately represent the underlying structure. But the system does not recognize this, because from its perspective, the signals are valid. They have passed through its own filters. They have been processed through its own logic. So the system trusts them. This is the second stage, propagation. Corrupted signals do not remain isolated. They move through feedback loops, reinforcing themselves as they circulate. Each cycle increases their perceived validity. Each repetition strengthens their influence over behavior. Over time, distortion becomes pattern, and pattern becomes assumed structure. This is where the system begins to reorganize itself around false signals, not because the architecture has changed, but because the interpretation of the architecture has shifted. This is the critical point. Because once signal corruption reaches this level, correction becomes difficult. The system is no longer operating from external interference alone. It is generating its own distortion internally. Even if the original source of pressure is removed, the corrupted signals remain active. They continue to circulate, reinforce, and reshape behavior. The system has internalized the error. This leads to the third stage, priority inversion. Signals that should be low impact become dominant. Minor variations begin to dictate major responses. High-priority structures are neglected, while peripheral fluctuations receive disproportionate attention. Energy distribution follows distortion. And once energy is misallocated, structural imbalance accelerates. Core pathways weaken. Peripheral pathways overdevelop. The system loses its center. This is not collapse, not yet. It is misalignment at scale. The system continues to function, but it is no longer aligned with its original design. Its responses are no longer proportional. Its adjustments are no longer accurate. It begins to operate in a distorted version of its own reality. And within that distortion, every correction moves it further away from stability. This is why signal corruption is more dangerous than direct attack. Because a direct attack can be identified. It can be isolated. It can be countered. Corruption cannot. Because it does not appear as threat. It appears as information. And the system trusts its own information more than anything external. That trust becomes the weakness. Loss of reference. Once signals are corrupted, the system loses something more critical than accuracy. It loses reference. At first, this loss is not obvious. The system continues to operate. Feedback loops still respond. Thresholds still activate. Energy still flows. From the outside, behavior appears consistent enough to avoid immediate collapse. But internally, a shift has occurred. The system no longer knows what it is aligning to. Reference is not a visible component of architecture. It is not a specific node or pathway. It is the underlying standard that defines correctness, the baseline against which all signals are evaluated, all adjustments are measured, and all decisions are justified. When reference is stable, the system can tolerate noise. It can absorb minor distortion, filter irrelevant signals, and maintain coherence even under pressure. Because every adjustment is anchored to something consistent. But when reference begins to erode, filtering fails. The system no longer distinguishes clearly between signal and noise. It cannot reliably determine which inputs should be prioritized and which should be ignored. Everything begins to carry uncertain weight. This is where instability deepens, because without reference, correction becomes arbitrary. The system continues to adjust, but those adjustments are no longer guided by a fixed standard. They are guided by shifting interpretations. Each response is based on the previous distorted signal, rather than an original stable structure. This creates drift, not sudden, gradual. Each adjustment moves the system slightly further from its initial configuration. Not enough to trigger immediate detection, but enough to accumulate over time. The system begins to redefine itself based on corrupted input. This is how identity dissolves. Not through destruction, through replacement. The original architecture is not removed. It is overwritten. Layer by layer, distorted signals redefine what the system considers normal. Feedback loops reinforce new patterns. Thresholds adapt to altered conditions. Energy redistributes toward new priorities. The system adapts, but it adapts incorrectly. This is the danger of adaptive systems under corrupted reference. They do not stop functioning, they evolve. And evolution without a stable reference leads away from coherence. At this stage, internal consistency may still exist. The system can appear stable within its own distorted logic. It produces predictable outcomes. It maintains internal alignment. But that alignment no longer reflects the original design. It reflects the corruption. This is false stability. And false stability is difficult to detect from within. Because everything still feels correct. Every signal confirms the system's current state. Every feedback loop reinforces its current behavior. There is no internal contradiction strong enough to trigger reevaluation. The system becomes self-consistent in error. This is the point where recovery becomes complex. Because to restore alignment, the system must recognize that its reference is compromised. But recognition depends on the very signals that are already corrupted. This creates a closed loop. The system cannot easily detect its own deviation. And without detection, correction is impossible. This is how systems lose control without collapsing. They continue to operate, but no longer according to their original architecture. They operate according to whatever has replaced it. Structural drift. Once reference is lost, the system does not stop. It continues. But it no longer knows where it is going. This is structural drift. Not a collapse, not a failure, a movement without direction. At this stage, the system still functions. It still produces outcomes. It still maintains internal consistency within its own altered state. From the outside, it may even appear adaptive, responsive to change, flexible under pressure, capable of evolving. But this appearance is misleading, because adaptation without reference is not evolution. It is displacement. The system begins to shift its structure incrementally. Each adjustment, each recalibration, each response to corrupted signals introduces a small deviation from the original architecture. Individually, these deviations are negligible. They do not trigger alarms. They do not appear significant, but they accumulate. And accumulation creates transformation. Not intentional transformation, uncontrolled transformation. The system does not choose its new direction. It arrives at it. Over time, core pathways begin to alter. Not dramatically, but enough to change flow patterns. Feedback loops begin reinforcing different outcomes than they were designed to. Thresholds adjust to new baselines that no longer match the original logic. The system becomes unfamiliar, but only when viewed from outside. From within, everything still feels coherent. This is the danger of drift. It preserves internal consistency while eroding external alignment. The system does not experience itself as broken. It experiences itself as updated. This is how drift hides. It disguises deviation as adaptation. And because the system continues to function, there is no immediate trigger for correction. No collapse forces reevaluation. No failure demands reconstruction. Instead, the system moves further, each cycle reinforcing its new configuration, each feedback loop stabilizing the altered structure, each decision embedding the drift deeper into its operation. This is where the original architecture begins to disappear, not in structure, but in influence. The original design no longer determines behavior. It exists as residual pattern, but it is no longer dominant. The system has reorganized around new priorities, new interpretations, new internal logic. And that logic is no longer aligned with its intended function. This creates a delayed consequence. Because drift does not produce immediate failure, it produces divergence. The system begins to generate outcomes that deviate from its purpose. At first, the deviation is small. Slight inefficiencies, minor inconsistencies, subtle misalignments. but over time these expand. The system moves further from its original objective, further from its optimal configuration, further from its intended role within the larger environment, until eventually it no longer fits. Not because it is broken, but because it is changed. And once a system drifts far enough, reintegration becomes difficult. Because returning requires recognizing the distance, and recognizing the distance requires a reference point that no longer exists. This is the final stage of early resistance, not destruction, displacement. The system is still intact, but it is no longer where it was designed to be. And from that position, every further movement increases the gap. Cascading failure. Structural drift does not remain isolated. At a certain point, accumulated deviation begins to interact with itself. What were once independent distortions, small misalignments in thresholds, minor inaccuracies in feedback, subtle shifts in energy distribution, start to overlap. Their effects compound. Their interactions produce new patterns that were never part of the original architecture. This is where drift transforms into cascade. A cascading failure is not a single breakdown. It is a chain reaction. Each layer of the system begins to destabilize the next, not because any one component has fully failed, but because the relationships between components have lost coherence. The system no longer operates as a unified structure. It becomes fragmented. At first, this fragmentation is functional. Different parts of the system continue to operate, but no longer in alignment with each other. Feedback loops produce signals that conflict with one another. Thresholds activate under conditions that do not match expected outcomes. Energy flows unevenly, concentrating in areas that do not support structural stability. The system is still active, but it is no longer coordinated. This is the beginning of systemic contradiction. Multiple internal logics begin to coexist, each one partially valid within its local context, each one incompatible at the global level. The system starts to generate conflicting behaviors. One pathway reinforces stability, while another amplifies instability. One layer attempts correction, while another deepens distortion. These actions do not cancel each other out. They interfere, and interference creates unpredictability. This unpredictability accelerates the cascade. Because once outcomes become inconsistent, the system increases its rate of adjustment. It attempts to compensate for instability by reacting more frequently, more aggressively, more broadly. But these reactions are still based on corrupted signals and lost reference. So every correction introduces new distortion. The cascade intensifies. At this stage, failure is no longer linear. It is exponential. Small disruptions propagate rapidly through interconnected pathways. A minor error in one node spreads through feedback loops, affecting multiple layers simultaneously. Each affected layer then produces its own distortions, feeding back into the system. The cycle accelerates. This is where systems begin to lose containment. Controlled deviation zones collapse. Boundaries between layers blur. Structural separation dissolves. The system can no longer isolate instability. Everything becomes connected to everything else. And once full interconnection is reached under unstable conditions, the system becomes highly sensitive to any input. Even minimal disturbance produces disproportionate response. This is volatility, not chaos. Volatility is structured instability. The system still follows patterns, but those patterns are no longer predictable. They shift rapidly, responding to internal amplification rather than external logic. At this point, the system appears unstable from both inside and outside. Internally, feedback loops contradict each other. Externally, outcomes become inconsistent. The system cannot maintain a stable identity across time. It begins to fluctuate between states, between behaviors, between configurations. This fluctuation is the visible form of cascading failure. But the deeper issue is not fluctuation itself. It is the loss of coherence. Because once coherence is lost, the system cannot return to a stable state without reconstruction. It no longer knows which configuration is correct. Every potential state carries some level of distortion. Every pathway contains residual error. The system becomes trapped in a field of unstable equilibrium, constantly adjusting, never resolving. This is where collapse becomes possible, not inevitable, but accessible. Because the system has lost its ability to absorb disturbance. Every new input adds to the cascade. Every attempt at correction feeds it. At this point, survival depends on something the system no longer fully possesses: clarity. Without clarity, there is no way to isolate error. Without isolation, there is no way to contain it. And without containment, the cascade continues. Not as a single event, but as an ongoing process, until the system either reconstructs or breaks. Defensive reconfiguration. Cascading failure does not always end in collapse. At a certain threshold, systems attempt something else. They reconfigure, not as a planned redesign, but as a defensive response. Because even in instability, systems retain one fundamental drive: to preserve continuity. When coherence breaks and cascade begins, the system can no longer rely on its original architecture. Its pathways are distorted. Its signals are corrupted. Its feedback loops amplify noise. Continuing in the same configuration only accelerates failure. So the system shifts, not back to its original state, but into a new one. This is defensive reconfiguration. It is not correction. It is survival. The system begins by isolating fragments of itself that still function. Not necessarily the most important parts, not necessarily the original core, but the parts that remain internally consistent under current conditions. These fragments become anchors, temporary centers around which the system reorganizes. This creates a new structure. But this structure is not aligned with the original design. It is aligned with what remains stable within distortion. This is the first shift, from designed architecture to adaptive architecture. The system sacrifices precision for stability. It simplifies pathways, reduces complexity, eliminates connections that introduce instability. Feedback loops are shortened. Thresholds are widened. Variability is reduced, not to guide behavior, but to prevent further cascade. This is containment through reduction. The system becomes smaller in function, but stronger in survival. This is why defensive reconfiguration often appears as stabilization. From the outside, the system seems to recover. Fluctuation decreases. Patterns begin to reemerge. Behavior becomes more predictable again. The visible signs of instability fade. But this stability is not the same as before. It is constrained. The system has lost capacity. It no longer operates at its previous level of complexity. Certain pathways are gone. Certain responses are no longer available. Certain behaviors that once defined its function are no longer possible. The system has adapted, but at a cost. This is structural compromise, and compromise introduces limitation. Because the new configuration is optimized for survival under pressure, not for optimal performance under ideal conditions. It is more resistant to disruption, but less capable of expansion. It can maintain itself, but struggles to evolve beyond its current state. This creates a new form of equilibrium, stable but reduced. This is where systems can become trapped, because once a defensive configuration stabilizes, it begins to reinforce itself. Feedback loops adapt to the new structure. Energy redistributes according to reduced pathways. The system learns to operate within its constraints. Over time, this constrained state becomes normalized. The system forgets its original capacity. It begins to treat limitation as structure. This is the second danger. Because defensive reconfiguration solves immediate instability, but introduces long-term stagnation. The system survives, but it stops progressing. It becomes resistant not only to disruption, but to growth. And this resistance is subtle. It does not appear as failure. It appears as stability, which makes it difficult to challenge. Because from within, the system feels safe. It feels controlled. It feels resolved. But in reality, it has shifted into a narrower version of itself. This is the trade-off: survival over potential, stability over expansion, containment over possibility. The architect must recognize this state, because a system that has reconfigured defensively is no longer aligned with its original purpose. It has adapted to pressure, but it has not resolved it. And unresolved pressure does not disappear. It waits until conditions change again. And when they do, the system will face the same question: adapt further or collapse. Residual pressure. Defensive reconfiguration creates stability, but it does not remove pressure. It redistributes it. What the system compresses to survive does not disappear. The forces that initiated disruption, external interference, signal distortion, loss of reference, remain active. They are no longer expressed through visible instability, but they continue to exist beneath the new structure. This is residual pressure. Not immediate, not explosive, but persistent. The system, now reconfigured, operates within a narrower band of stability. It has reduced variability, simplified pathways, and constrained feedback. This creates resistance to further disruption, but it also creates containment. Pressure that cannot be expressed begins to accumulate, not in obvious forms, but in latent tension. At first, this tension is manageable. The system holds. Its reduced complexity allows it to absorb minor disturbances. Feedback loops are no longer over-amplified. Thresholds are less reactive. The system appears calm, controlled, recovered. But this calm is conditional, because the pressure has not been resolved. It has been suppressed, and suppressed pressure behaves differently. It does not dissipate. It waits. Residual pressure begins to concentrate in areas that the new structure cannot fully stabilize. Points where adaptation was incomplete. Layers where distortion still exists, but has been contained rather than corrected. These become stress zones. They are not immediately visible, but they are structurally significant. Because under stable conditions, they remain quiet. Under changing conditions, they activate. This is the delayed risk of defensive systems. They function well until conditions shift, and conditions always shift. A small increase in external interference, a minor change in energy distribution, a subtle variation in timing. Any of these can reactivate residual pressure. And when reactivated, it does not return as the same disruption. It returns amplified, because it has been accumulating. This is the hidden instability within stabilized systems. Not instability in operation, but instability in potential. The system appears stable, but it is carrying unresolved tension forward in time. This creates fragility, not in structure, but in response. Because when pressure reemerges, the system does not respond from a neutral state. It responds from a state already carrying internal load. Its capacity to absorb additional disturbance is reduced. And when capacity is reduced, thresholds are reached faster. This accelerates breakdown, not because the system is weak, but because it is already under strain. This is why defensive reconfiguration is not a final solution. It is a temporary alignment, a pause in visible instability. But beneath that pause, the original forces remain active, waiting for conditions that allow them to surface again. This creates a cycle: disruption, adaptation, stabilization, accumulation, reactivation. Each cycle reshapes the system. Each cycle reduces its margin for error. Each cycle moves it further from its original architecture. unless something changes, unless the system does not simply adapt, but resolves. Because pressure that is not resolved will always return. Not necessarily in the same form, not necessarily at the same scale, but with greater impact. This is the critical realization. Stability is not the absence of disruption. It is the management of unresolved forces. And as long as those forces remain active, the system is not complete. It is waiting. Strategic adaptation. Not all systems remain reactive. At a certain level of pressure, a different response becomes possible. Instead of continuing the cycle of disruption and defensive reconfiguration, the system begins to change its approach entirely. It stops reacting to pressure as something to suppress and starts treating it as information to interpret. This is strategic adaptation. Not survival, not correction, reorientation. Because the system finally recognizes something critical. Pressure is not random. It is patterned. Every disturbance, every inconsistency, every interference signal carries structure. Not always visible, not always immediately coherent, but structured enough to be analyzed. What previously appeared as noise begins to reveal repetition. What seemed chaotic begins to show direction. This is the first shift, from reaction to observation. The system slows its responses, not because it has lost capability, but because it stops responding immediately to every signal. It allows pressure to accumulate long enough to reveal its shape. It observes where disturbances originate, how they propagate, and which layers they affect most consistently. This creates clarity. Not perfect clarity, but sufficient. Because once patterns are identified, pressure is no longer treated as an unpredictable force. It becomes a map, and maps can be used. This is where adaptation becomes strategic. Instead of tightening thresholds across the system selectively adjusts them. Instead of amplifying feedback everywhere, it refines feedback at specific nodes. Instead of compressing variability globally, it redistributes variability where it provides structural advantage. This is precision. The system stops overcorrecting. It begins to calibrate, because it understands that not all disturbances require suppression. Some reveal weaknesses that must be addressed. Others indicate external forces that can be redirected rather than resisted. This leads to the second shift, from defense to positioning. The system begins to move relative to pressure, not physically, structurally. It adjusts its internal configuration in ways that change how pressure interacts with it. Certain pathways are reinforced to absorb predictable disturbances. Others are relaxed to allow controlled dissipation. Some layers become more rigid. Others become more flexible. This creates balance, not static balance, dynamic balance. The system is no longer trying to eliminate pressure. It is distributing it. Because pressure, when properly managed, can stabilize rather than destabilize. It can reinforce structure by constantly testing it. It can strengthen pathways by forcing them to adapt under controlled conditions. This is the third shift, from resistance to integration. External forces are no longer treated as threats. They become inputs. The system begins to incorporate certain disturbances into its own operation. Not all of them. Only those that can be predicted, shaped, or redirected. These inputs become part of the system's feedback architecture, strengthening its ability to adapt without losing coherence. This is where resilience transforms, from passive endurance to active alignment. The system is no longer defined by how well it survives disruption, but by how effectively it uses disruption. This is the difference between stability and control. Stability absorbs, control redirects. At this stage, the system regains something it lost earlier, reference, but not the original reference, a new one. A reference built from interaction with pressure rather than isolation from it. This reference is more complex, more flexible, and more robust because it has been tested against external forces. It does not assume ideal conditions. It operates within real ones. This is the critical advantage. Because a system that adapts strategically does not return to its original form. It evolves beyond it, not through uncontrolled drift, but through deliberate integration of external pressure into its own structure. This is where the system begins to regain control, not by eliminating resistance, but by understanding it. The shift from resistance to leverage. Resistance is not the end of control. It is the beginning of refinement. Up to this point, resistance has appeared as disruption, distortion, pressure applied from outside the system. It has exposed weaknesses, triggered instability, forced adaptation. It has revealed the limits of architecture that was designed in isolation. But once the system reaches strategic adaptation, resistance changes. It is no longer something to overcome. It becomes something to use. This is the final shift of this phase, from resisting pressure to leveraging it. Because pressure is not only a destabilizing force, it is directional. Every external system that pushes back does so with its own structure, its own logic, its own distribution of energy, its own patterns of interference. And those patterns are not random. They reveal intent. They reveal pathways. They reveal where force is being applied and where it is not. This is information. And information, when understood, becomes leverage. The system begins to read resistance as a signal of external architecture. Where pressure concentrates, there is structure. Where interference repeats, there is pattern. Where disruption aligns, there is direction. This allows the system to move differently, not away from pressure, through it. Because pressure defines gradients, and gradients define movement. Instead of reinforcing all boundaries equally, the system begins to identify where pressure is weakest, where resistance is inconsistent, where opposing systems lack cohesion. These become points of passage, not points of conflict, points of advantage. The system starts to expand selectively, not by pushing directly against resistance, but by flowing through gaps within it. It redirects its own energy along paths that encounter the least opposition while still advancing its structure. This is strategic movement, not force, but positioning. At the same time, the system begins to reshape pressure itself. Because once pressure is understood, it can be influenced. Small adjustments in timing, energy distribution, and feedback placement can alter how external systems apply force. They can redirect interference toward less critical areas. They can amplify inconsistencies in opposing structures. They can create imbalance within the source of resistance itself. This is inversion. The system is no longer reacting to pressure. It is shaping it. External forces that once destabilized the system begin to lose coherence. Their interference becomes less effective. Their patterns become more predictable. Their impact becomes easier to absorb, redirect, or neutralize. Over time, resistance weakens, not because it disappears, but because it loses alignment. This is the critical transformation. The system does not eliminate opposition. It destabilizes it. And once opposing systems begin to fragment, their pressure becomes less concentrated, less consistent, less capable of producing meaningful disruption. At this stage, the system regains expansion capacity, not by returning to its original architecture, but by operating from a higher level of integration. It has been tested, distorted, reconfigured, adapted, and through that process, it has gained something that cannot be designed in isolation. Context. The system now understands not only itself, but the environment in which it operates. It recognizes patterns beyond its own boundaries. It anticipates external responses. It adjusts before pressure is applied, rather than after. This is predictive control. And predictive control is more powerful than reactive control, because it reduces the need for correction. The system no longer waits for disruption to occur. It moves in ways that make disruption less effective from the beginning. This is where resistance completes its function, not as a threat, but as a filter. Only systems capable of adaptation, integration, and reconfiguration pass through this phase intact. Others collapse, fragment, or remain trapped in defensive states. The ones that pass through become different. Not stronger in the traditional sense, more aware, more precise, more aligned with the dynamics of the environment. And at this level, control changes again. It is no longer about shaping a system in isolation. It is about operating within a field of systems, where influence is relative, where movement is strategic, where pressure is constant. This is the transition, from system architecture to system interaction. Because once systems begin to leverage resistance instead of reacting to it, they stop being contained. They become participants in a larger structure. And that structure defines the next phase.